I'm curious, when you were younger, what was your favorite children's book? And when you think about that book, what was it about that book that made it so special to you? Was it the story itself? Or maybe the characters that you could relate to and connect with? Or maybe it was the illustrations that just made the story come to life? Well, whatever it was that made that book special to you, those are the elements that are so important to a children's book. And we talk about all of that with our guest today. Today, I interview Julie Boden Schmidt, who is the best-selling author of Woody's Leap of Faith, a heartwarming children's story about a character named Woody and how he overcomes his fear of heights. We talk about what it took to come up with the idea for the story and write it and find an illustrator and all of the ins and outs of bringing a children's story to market and lots of other things as well. Julie shares some very powerful stories about how her book has already made an impact. There's lots more as we go into this conversation, so I invite you to sit back and listen in as Julie Boden Schmidt shares her story. Julie, good morning. Welcome to It Just Takes One.
Thank you. I'm excited.
I am excited too. Is this the first podcast that you've done?
It is.
Oh, I feel very special.
I feel a bit scared.
Well, together we're going to make it great. So I'm
Okay.
happy that you're here. I'm excited to talk about your book, Woody's Leap of Faith. Those that are watching this on YouTube are looking at the book now, and we'll make sure that it's in the notes and people that are listening can see it as well. I'm excited to talk about the book. I'm excited to talk about what this book has become and what's next. But let's just start where I like to begin, which is how we even connected, because I always think the connections are interesting. And, two people that are seemingly literally on opposite coasts of the country come together and are sitting here together right now doing a podcast. Let's share a little bit about how you and I connected.
You and I connected through my spouse, Vicki, who is always looking for motivational books and books on fitness. I cannot tell you how many we have in our home. And so she was looking for books like that, and she came across a book by Todd Durkin, a trainer, fitness expert, motivational speaker, and his book just struck a chord with her. So she pursued how she could be linked up with him, and she joined the Impact program. And I have to say, during that time, we were in Arizona, and she was crazed because she was in a competition, and there's 16 buildings in our compound. She was running up the stairs of all 16 buildings because she was going to win, which is part of her nature.
She did win, P.S.
Yeah, she did win. And in the process, she hooked up with you as a coach. And so she learned more about you, really connected. And every once in a while, over 31 years, I'd say, I really would like to write a book. So she said, you need to call Kelly because she's part of this Scriptor publishing. She can help you do that. And we were talking last night, and she said, and you didn't do it. And so, days, weeks would pass. She said, you should call Kelly. And like, yeah, okay, fine. And I wouldn't do it. And last night she said, I think maybe you were afraid of failure. And I said, no, it was actually before the fear of failure. Like, can I even do this? Talked about it for years. Can I do it? But one day, probably I was tired of hearing, you have to talk to Kelly. And I had an idea by then. I talked to you. And as they say, the rest is history. Not only did I get connected with you in terms of the publishing, but of course our book club and the richness of that. So life took a little veer, and here I am.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. A couple things there that I want to come back to, because You describe that sense, the fear, and it wasn't the fear of failure yet. It was the fear of even, can I do it? That is something I want to reiterate, because a lot of people that come to us will say that's the thing that stopped them for however many years they might have said that they wanted to become an author, but they're not sure they can actually do it.
Yes.
And if that's where they stop, the book never gets done. But luckily, in your case, you had a cheerleader
Yes.
urging you, beating you over the head, perhaps with
Right.
it. And so I encourage people, if you are in the boat that Julie's describing and you're thinking, can I do it? Get people around you, talk to people around you, and get the support, because I do think that support helps you move forward to the
Yes.
next step, which is the fear of failure, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say not only were you in that kind of publishing role, you very much were in that coaching role. You know, you can do it. Let's move on. What do you think about this? Have you thought about that? And so it made it so much easier than I thought it would be. And then it started to flow.
Hmm. And it really did start to flow. You had this idea. Let's talk a little bit about the idea, because the book's called Woody's Leap of Faith. And you came up with the idea for this little character. Tell that story, because it's a great story about how Woody even came to be.
So I was doing some consulting with a health center in central Montana. And this is a part of Montana that probably has more cattle than people. There was one main street, and I was on a break, and I was walking down the street and happened to look into this window. I think it was probably like a gift shop. And there were these 3 photographs in a single frame. And the first photograph on the left was a mother duck looking out of a nest that was in a tree. And the next photo was 3 little ducklings looking out of the nest. And the last photo was the 3 little ducklings in the air. So I went away, but it had just touched me. And the next day I came back and I bought it. And I hung it in our home in Arizona. And every time I looked at it, I said to myself, there's a story there, but didn't think about it too much. And then one day I said, I'd like to know more about these ducklings. And I found out they were wood ducks. I didn't know anything about wood ducks. What I discovered was that the day after they hatch, well, let me back up. Nowadays, some wood ducks nest in birdhouses that are made for wood ducks, but a lot of them still nest in trees. And they can nest anywhere from 20 to 300 feet up in a hole in a tree. The day after the ducklings hatch, they have to jump out of the nest, and they can't fly yet. They won't be able to fly for 6 or 8 weeks. And so I'm like, whoa, that's got to be scary. And I was thinking, one of those has got to be really scared to do that. And interestingly enough, the picture was titled A Leap of Faith. Mm-hmm. So I kind of sat back and sat on that. And then one day, 2 things happened. One was COVID. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, there was no consulting, there was no work. I'd spent a month of having come back from Alaska, kind of recovering from 5 months doing work in Alaska. And it was like, well, now what am I going to do with my life? And I happened to be in Arizona, and there was Woody, my little duckling on the wall. And as a result, he became my character, and I fell in love with him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why I was able to write the book, because suddenly this was a character I just loved. He was afraid, he was cute, you just wanted to squish him. Mm-hmm. And that's how it all started.
I love that. I think it's always interesting to think about where the inspirations come from, and how many times we look at something in like you were looking at this picture thinking, oh, there's a story there, but then you go on with your day and you don't ever think about it again. But for some reason, it kept coming back to you, and it kept kind of nudging you until you finally were able to see this character. The character of Woody became an emotional attachment, but also a 3D. You really
Yes.
could see him. You had a vision of him in your mind. I remember talking to you about that. So the process of creation and how we go from just this passing thought to actually creating this thing is interesting. You and I walked through that process, and I'd love to share with the listeners a little bit about your process, because once you had this vision of Woody and you were in love with this little character and you started to put yourself into his shoes, his webbed feet, then you had to start creating the story. Share with the listeners how you went about that process.
It's interesting because I think I'm going to kind of take a little detour here. I'm in Lawrence, Kansas right now, and they have a final Friday art walk on the last Friday of the month. And so I went on it last night with a friend. And by each set of pictures by an artist, they would talk about the artist, and the artist would talk about kind of what that art meant for them. And what struck me was that it was more than just I paint pretty pictures. It hits me in the heart. I set it aside and suddenly I have a conversation with it. And it was so connected with that individual, far beyond a paintbrush. That's what happened. And so I'm not sure I really remember exactly going through step by step. I started with, okay, he's hatched. Now what? Well, now he does not want to get out of that shell. And then I thought, well, there were 3 ducklings. So I wonder what the other 2 are like. And so Buzz appeared, his brother. Interestingly enough, my brother gave me the idea for the buzz cut on Buzz. And he wears sunglasses. And he probably, in the next book, you understand he has a little bit of ADHD. So he's just dancing around the nest ready to go. And then I said, well, there should be a sister. And so Zoe appeared. And Zoe wears a tutu because she wants to be a ballerina. And she's also lively, but not nearly as loud as Buzz, which she frequently says in the book. And once those 3 characters got developed, it kind of took off from there, because I really was thinking, here is this frightened little duckling sitting in the nest. And at some point he has to jump out. And what is he going to go through to do that? And so he went on a journey and I went on a journey with him, ending up with him finally taking that leap of faith and jumping after trying to figure out all sorts of ways, first of all, to explain why he was not going to jump. And secondly, trying to figure out other ways to get down. And a rope and a ladder just didn't seem like it was going to be very plausible. So again, I think I don't even know the right word for it, but it was this journey that just kind of started to develop a life of its own. And when it was done, I knew it was done.
Mm-hmm. I think that happens often when you get into a work, whatever it is, you sort of create the arc of the journey,
Yes.
where the character goes. But when you really put yourself into the story and put yourself into the character, then you begin to experience it so that you can then write about it. And I remember having a conversation with you when we were talking about what that fear really feels like, the fear of heights.
Yes.
And I asked you, is that something you've ever experienced? And you shared a story with me about that. Would you care to share that?
Well, now I'm trying to remember what the story was.
I think it was going up on the diving board.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I actually, there's another fear that I had that I just recently remembered, but I was taking a junior life saving. My mother was going back to college and she would take 4 children, live in this little tiny apartment, and we got to do our own thing. So I was taking junior life saving, and I didn't realize that one of the things you had to do was jump off the high dive. And so I climbed up. That was okay. climbing out was not so okay. And then I just stood there and it was like, well, now what am I going to do? I'm really afraid to jump. But the saying on the ground, you have to jump to pass. And so I did. I kind of took a leap of faith, jumped, made the mistake of looking at the water, got a good face splat. But I did it. And what I remembered the other day, another time when I was really frightened, is I was at a retreat and the facilitator made us close our eyes and walk around the room. And I just stood still. And later she commented on that. That surprised her. And it was like, well, that was safe. I just didn't move, wasn't going to run into anything. And although I hadn't remembered it at the time that I was writing the story, I think in some ways that's what Woody did. He just wanted to stay safe and in one place. So I think I was bringing out those moments when I truly was fearful and managed to overcome them, and brought it to this little character.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the reason for writing it as a children's book is the recognition that children often experience these fears and they don't know what to do with them. As adults, we can deal with it a little bit differently, but kids are experiencing these fears in a different way. So you chose to write this children's book, and your background is not in working with children. So what made you think it's going to be a children's book? It's not just a book about overcoming fear. It's going to be a children's book.
Well, it's interesting because I had started a book before and I love mysteries. So I assumed, well, I'll write mysteries. And I actually had like 8 chapters outlined. Clearly it didn't grab me because I still have the 8 chapters outlined. And that was 20 years ago. So I think as I thought about, one, it was Woody. It was that character. And I wanted to speak to children, and I knew I wanted to have some kind of lesson in the book, but I didn't want to be a lesson that hit you over the head. It would be subtle. And I hope I achieved that, where, fear and being brave is intermixed with humor and scary moments and funny moments. And so it just became apparent, if you will, that this is targeted towards kids. But what I've discovered is that other people like it. And I want to tell you a story. Thinking about fear, I had a staff person come in yesterday and he handed me my book. I said, you bought the book. He says, I want you to autograph it to my twins. And I did. His son has a sensory disorder and it makes him very fearful of things. And he said his son loved the book because Woody was afraid. But Woody overcame that fear. And his dad, being very perceptive, said, wherever you see the name Woody, put your name in. These are 12-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And so I had kind of initially started out, maybe a 4 to 9-year-old. I'll tell you later, there was a high school group that heard my book and were, quote, mesmerized. Mm-hmm. And adults laugh at it. So in a sense, I wrote a book that hopefully anybody could enjoy, but is really for children.
My heart is so warm just hearing that story of how you helped his son. And I think that, all of us that put a work of art of any sort out into the world, our hope is that it touches somebody, but I don't know that we always get to know who it touches. We just put it out there and you don't always get to meet. So for you to be able to have him come in and say this helped his son, how did that feel?
But same as you, it just warmed my heart, touched me. And it was like, that wasn't my intent as I wrote the book. The intent was to write a book that children could connect with. But I'm so thrilled that happened. And that it did touch this young boy, and he has challenges in life. And to have him say, here's somebody kind of like me, he's afraid of like going upstairs and closed in spaces, and Woody's afraid of jumping. So who knows? Maybe there's other kids out there having the same experience. I actually hope so.
Yeah. Or like you said, even other adults, people,
Yes.
that's a way of looking at fear a little bit differently.
Yes. Yeah.
So writing a book is one thing. Writing a children's book is a completely different thing, in part because of what you're describing, wanting to write it in a way that a child will be able to receive it.
Mhm.
But the illustration of a children's book is an extremely important part of the process. And you happen to partner up with an extremely talented illustrator. And so I want to talk about Michelle. Let's share a little bit about how the two of you connected and why you knew that she was the one to become the illustrator for this story.
So it was time to pick an illustrator. And of course, here I am, a first time writer. It was like, okay, how do I do that? And I had connected with a couple of people, and you had done, I believe, a web search for illustrators. And Michelle, at one point, had actually had dedicated herself to graphic design. She did cards a lot. But when the recession hit, she had to go back to teaching school. But she still had her web page. And so she was one of the three people that I sent parts of the story to and asked them to submit pictures. As soon as I saw that first picture, which is Woody in his shell with a look like, oh, wow, yikes, I knew she was it. And it took, I had loved this little character, but then seeing the character just took it to another level.
Yeah, I'm going to show that picture because I want them to see.
And she captures that look of, uh-oh.
It is such a beautiful image, and absolutely you can see the expression and the detail that she brings out in the emotion of this character.
Yes.
So beautiful. And because you had such a vision in your mind of what this character is, getting somebody to be able to translate your vision,
Yes.
it seems like an impossibility. So, in many ways, it's just amazing that you connected and found that person.
Yeah. And Michelle and I have really become partners, if you will. Not just an illustrator who I paid to do a job. In fact, her oldest son developed a web page for me. And Michelle lives in Oregon, but not far from where I grew up in Washington State. And the first time we ever connected by phone, her husband at the time had a wood duck carving on the wall, and her daughter, I think is like middle school or maybe younger, about 8 or 9, was writing a story about wood ducks. So it was like, okay, this is it. It's karma. We have connected and we've stayed connected. And would you mind if I read you something that she just sent me?
I would love to hear it.
It was so great. So we're in communication a lot, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. She said, by the way, today in my high school art class, and this is important, it's high school, I was showing them the book and they asked me to read it to them. And you could have heard a pin drop because they were so engaged and mesmerized by the story. They loved it and thought it was perfect for starting the school year. They want to buy it also. And it was like, both of us were like, wow, because honestly, the book wouldn't be the same without Michelle's illustrations. And so it had to be both to make it a success. And to me, I said yesterday to Vicki, to me, success is not how many books I sell. It's, do I have that kind of impact that I just described? And that's really all I need.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. I also want to, I don't even know if you know this or if we talked about it, maybe it's something you wouldn't have remembered, but just to really put the exclamation point on the karma of the connection.
Mhm.
When I actually wasn't a web search. I actually put it out to my contacts. I think I put it out on Facebook or something to say if anybody was interested in submitting some photo or some illustrations for a book. And Michelle was actually a friend was referred by one of my friends, Cindy Henderson, who was with me in the Todd Durkin mastermind group. So you mentioned Vicki connecting with Todd in his book. Cindy connected with Todd and me through his mastermind group.
Yeah.
And she's the one who referred Michelle. So there's the way the universe works, if you allow it.
Yeah. I did not know that. So that's great. Yeah, she's an amazing person. I've already signed her up for the second book because my fear is as soon as they read that name, I'm not going to have time. She's not going to have time for me. So we're starting to work together again.
Yes, she's extremely talented, and the illustrations do really help capture the words of the book. And I think that's something that people that haven't really thought about writing children's books may not realize is that the words are not enough for children. They need to see the images, and they have to be just right, or the message will be lost. Yeah, she did a great job. So that was one of those really synergistic connections that happened out of the blue. And so what has happened? You've described a little bit in terms of your coworkers' son being influenced by it. Certainly, these high school students being influenced by it. What else have you experienced now that you can actually walk out into the world and say, I'm a published Amazon bestselling author?
One thing is that I had business cards made up, and a little circle, and I discovered clip art that for $12.50 you can get a week's worth of photo ready clips. And so I got my little business card, and when I would I happened to mention that I was writing a book, people would say, oh, let me know when it comes out, and I'll say, here's the information. And so it's been interesting to see who has then followed up on that. So my book is now in Sweden because one of the physicians I work with, one of his grandchildren lives in Sweden. And of course, that's where my grandparents came from. So I wrote to them, and then he wanted them all autographed. He came to me with a sack of the books, and I said, oh, wow, you bought the books. And I handed it back to him, and he said, no. Handed it back to me. He said, I want you to sign them. So to his grandchildren. And so to his two Swedish grandchildren, I wrote a little bit in English. And then I said, from one Swede to another. And then I put in the Swedish word for enjoy. So the book is now in Sweden. I think you took it to Ireland. Did you?
I did. Your book is now in Ireland.
And it's going in the library where we live in Washington State. And so it's interesting, the process of people kind of, I have a sister-in-law who has more great nieces and nephews than I can ever imagine. So she bought 11 books. And then it starts to go from there. And so at this point, I really don't know how many books have been bought, but I know that people who do go ahead, they connect with me. And I kind of hadn't thought about that would be part of this whole process of people saying to you, wow, that was a great book. I loved it. My kids loved it. And then telling me, some more specifics. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's been my experience since then. And part of it, part of the experience is just having never written a book, that whole writing, getting it published was a journey I didn't realize was quite so complicated. And, trying to find time to make sure I I was true to that at the same time dealing with the rest of my life.
Yeah, because this is not your full-time job.
No, it is not.
And you didn't even intend to have a full-time job, but in the midst of this, you got a full-time job.
That's
So
right.
as you're doing this interim work right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is, I'm glad you actually brought that up, the idea of these connections, because certainly books do connect people. And it's an unexpected side benefit of
Yes.
getting your work out into the world, is that you meet people or hear from people that you would never, ever have connected with had it not been the book that brought you together.
Yes. And what's interesting is this physician, um, when I first came to this interim position, um, I had to say to him one day, I don't take threats lightly. Because he was kind of this gruff guy, older man, kind of like, if you don't, and I've come to know him, we've developed a working relationship. But there was a leap when I saw the side of him about his grandchildren, and he saw a side of me that he liked, and it changed our relationship. So here it was, kind of going along, um, and then now connecting on that. And he could tell me about his granddaughters. He just lit up, and he could give me the book to sign for them. So again, something I hadn't expected, but happened.
Yeah, an interesting way of breaking down walls.
Yes, very.
Very, and that's great. I will share you. I did bring it to Ireland. I was just in Ireland with my daughters, as I was telling you a couple weeks ago. And my cousin there has a little boy, Isaac, who is 15 months old. And so as I was leaving, I was, packing some things to bring as gifts. And your book had just come out not too long before that. And I had ordered a few copies because I knew I would be giving it out. And the only disappointment that I can share is I didn't have time to send it to you to get it signed. If I had had time, I would have, but I didn't have enough time. So I brought the book, and on the last day, he brought Isaac over, and I gave him the book. And so he got a chance to play with it. And his mother is a social worker. And so she was, going through it with him. And
Yes.
so, yeah, it has made it to the shores of Ireland.
I have two pictures of people with babies and the book, and they're probably about the age that you're talking about. I think they were probably ready to chew on it, but it looked like they were reading as they were heading towards the page. But someday, give them a couple of years, and their parents will read to them, and then they'll read it themselves, and then maybe they'll write a book. Who knows?
Oh, there you go. Wouldn't that be a great gift?
Yeah.
So what's next for you? You've said you're sort of working on this second book. What's your vision of what you're going to continue to do in terms of writing?
Well, I definitely have a second book already in mind and outlined. It just didn't feel like the story was done. And the second book is still following these little characters. And originally I thought it was going to focus on Buzz. And then it didn't. It somehow writing just takes its own path sometimes. And so they've all now jumped out of the nest, and Mother Duck informs them that now they're going to water, which is what wood ducks do. And they'll swim. And Woody basically is, I just jumped out of a tree. I don't intend to swim. No way, I'm not swimming. And in the process of getting to the river, Buzz takes many little side trips and then finally gets lost. And so I will weave something in there about that child that's kind of hyperactive. But Woody decides that he has two choices. He can go look for Buzz, or he can go swimming. He decides looking for Buzz is far better choice because he'll do it all from the shore. And as he goes, he encounters other animals. So this time, other animals are coming into it. And the picture on the web page about coming next is he's sitting on top of what he thought was a rock, contemplating, I still haven't found Buzz, but the rock is really an aged, cranky turtle with little round glasses who basically says, "What do you think I am, buddy?" And each time he encounters animals where he's saying, "Have you seen Buzz?" they one laugh because Buzz is described as he's this big, this tall, and he wears sunglasses and he has a buzz cut. And he's still wearing his little red helmet, which was the magic helmet in the first book that gave him that feeling that he could do it. And so seeing a little duckling in a red helmet is quite humorous to some of these people too, these characters. One, a muskrat asking him, going bicycling. And so it's evolving and new characters are coming in, these other animals, but Woody is still there and having adventures. I don't know where it's going exactly. So it's been set aside while I do other work, but I trust at some point I'm going to figure out where it's going. It doesn't have an end yet.
Describe that process, because I think it's in, everyone has their creative process in a different way, but something that you described there I think is really intriguing, which is I thought the character was going to go this way, but it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? What do you exactly mean by, because ultimately you're the writer, right? You're in control
Right.
of this character. It can do whatever you want it to do, but you described that as if the character had its own control of this story.
Honestly, I think in some way it does. And of course, it's me, but it's the part of me that is linked to this character. And so I don't find writing or this writing as something that is kind of intellectual and kind of removed from my feelings. It's just there, kind of in my heart, my soul. And so I really thought this would follow Buzz. And it wasn't very long into an outline that I just felt, and that's the best word, and it's hard to describe what that feeling was, but no, this is still about Woody and bringing in Buzz, who's off doing his own thing, but that he still had an adventure he needed to take, and he shows some fears still, and but he's braver now. So I think it shows that journey too. So yeah, I wish I could describe that. There was a moment when I said, nope, this isn't going to be about Buzz. This is going to be about Woody. And it wasn't that clear. It just happened, kind of. And so almost intuitively, I guess, I really, in work and in writing and in play, I trust my intuition. And so I just intuitively knew, no, for the story to mean something to me and to have a life that I want it to have, it's going to go this way now. It's kind of amorphous, but
yeah, no, it's really, it's actually a really interesting conversation because what I hear you describing and what I've heard other artists, and not just writers, but artists describe, some would call it sort of the flow state. When you get out of your head and into your gut or into your heart, as you describe it, that intuitive space where you feel something is different than the mental space where you're thinking something, right? Those are two different energies. And Elizabeth Gilbert describes it really beautifully. I think it's in her book, Big Magic, where she talks about how we all have sort of these antenna up all the time, sort of sensing ideas, ideas are literally being picked up, thought about. But there's a distinct difference between when it's picked up mentally and you think about it, like you described when you saw the picture and you thought there's a story behind it. You picked it up, but then it somehow sifts down and comes together from another space.
Mhm.
And that's what you just actually really beautifully described as this intuitive sense that
Yes.
this is the direction I need to take it.
Yeah. And at that point, at least the outline of it becomes easy. I know from working on this one, filling in the details and having it read well and write well, that's not as easy. But the idea, the vision suddenly becomes fairly easy. And I'm actually just kind of sitting and waiting. Um, what I typically do is suddenly there will be this kind of idea, and I immediately go to my notes on my phone and I put it, there's a folder called Buzz's book, because that's how it started out. And so I'll just make those little notes. And when I have time, I go back and see, and sometimes I say, yeah, well, that was an interesting idea, but it doesn't ring true, or I need to follow that up. So still a lot of time ahead of me to flesh it out and work on it. And that time will come.
When it's just right, as this one did.
Yeah.
If people are now hopefully as intrigued about this book as we've described it, where can they get it?
I get it on Amazon.com under Woody's Leap of Faith. If they put in Julie on the search, Julie Boden Schmidt, which is how I'm listed as the author, they will get an SCHMITT. And I talked to the person who's my link with Amazon, and basically we can't fix it. So I'm just like, it still comes up my book.
Spelled wrong.
Well, there are technical problems everywhere. I'm not the only one who has them. And so that's how they get it, through Amazon.com.
Excellent. And also I should say that on our Scriptor page, I think there's a link to the Amazon link.
And on my webpage, which is juliebodenschmidt.com. And I'm going to double check with that. Yes, www.juliebodenschmidt.com. There is a link also to Amazon. And that also is where on the webpage you'll see when the next one is actually up.
Nice. Well, certainly it's inspiring to anyone out there who's interested in writing a book, and especially a children's book, to know that it can be done, that first fear of can I do it can be overcome, and the fear of failure can be overcome.
Yes.
And the success of knowing that what you put out there actually impacted somebody, made an impression, mesmerized somebody, can happen. And that's pretty powerful.
It is powerful. And it's just one of those treasures you get in your life, that through the stressful times, difficult times, you can just go back to that little treasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Julie, as we finish up today, I always like to end the conversation by just asking what the term "it just takes one" means to you. And I'm just curious.
So I actually thought about that a lot. And I had several "it just takes one." It took one picture that captured my heart. And that was probably the big one. It took one last nudge from my spouse to move me from that picture to writing a book. And it took one little character, Woody, who came alive and helped me write the book. And those were the ones. Surrounding all those, it just took one, was one of you and one of the editor of the grammar, and one of the page editor, and Michelle. But I would say those were the ones that really resulted in the book being written.
Yeah, that were enough to give you the confidence. And in fact, more than confidence, like you couldn't stop it once it had that momentum going.
Yeah.
It had to come out.
Yeah, this one, it would never have been left lying in my drawer like the other one is.
Yeah, Woody had to be here.
That's right. And Vicky said, "Oh, you know what we need? We need little plush Woody dolls." I think you talked about that too. And if I wanted to buy 500, I could indeed get a plush Woody doll, and I would really love to have one. But we're setting that aside.
When the time is right,
That's right.
he will appear in that form.
That's right.
Julie, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, but it was also just a pleasure to work with you. Just the way that you went through this process and took it a step at a time and poured your heart into this process. It has just been such a pleasure. And I'm just so happy that although this is the first, it will not be the last, because I know there is so much more in you that needs to be shared.
Thank you very much.
And we will talk with you soon.